6 months ago, CGS asked the Foundation to do a study into the topic we just talked about, and I was lucky enough to do most of that groundwork. And the Foundation's approach is not to sit behind a desk and to study papers, but it's to get out on the ground and speak to people from private soldier to president. So for the last 6 months, I've packed my bags and I've been off around sub-Saharan Africa, having quite a ball. The first point I would make is actually normally when you're asked to do a study into how the Army headquarters works, this is a problem that has been studied quite recently. And you dig into the archives and you find that only a year previously or 2 years previously, there was something you could work off. I was staggered actually to find that this area has not been studied, with the exception of a brief look by the Stability Unit at a specific angle of this. So actually, it flagged up to me that it was really an area worth applying brain power to. And what I have really enjoyed in the last 6 months, which perhaps you didn't get in your sort of last 4 years of my military career, was the time to think. And I thought in my 10 minutes, I would offer 5 reflections and 5 themes that I have picked up over the last 6 months. And my first reflection is that our history is important in Africa because it's the lens through which other people see us. And actually, we don't understand it very well at all. I would point out as a case study our signing up to the European Economic Community in 1973. And by the Act of Union in 1987, our trade is import and exports from Africa is in low single-figure percentages, and our aid budget is only 16% of the French. So, colonialism went very quickly, but actually post-exiting from colonialism, our attention became rapidly focused on Europe, and we were in very much a high reverse mode. And you don't really see a change until the election of a Labour government in 1997 and the creation of DFID and a completely different aid agenda based on poverty, delinked perhaps from what defence is doing. That history has a huge impact on how people see us. It's completely different from how France was engaged in colonialism and its withdrawal from colonialism. And so actually, what happened in Mali is entirely predictable based on the history of that period. My second point is that our engagements over this period, really since 1980, has been characterized, and I'm going to use some shorthand here, by DAs and their dwindling teams, by reducing allocation of course places for overseas students in the UK, and for smaller training teams who have been extremely effective, but the amount of resource that we've put into this, I would argue, has become sort of subcritical. The third point I would make, and I'm sort of going to touch on some area that Sarah was talking about, is that often the military is part of the power structure in the country, and often there's a debate in the country about how strong that military should be. And so second lieutenant smoothly shaven, rocking up with a short-term training team, can often find himself working against the national strategic direction. And we do that because we don't really understand what is going on. Which brings me to my fourth reflection. It took the British Army quite a long time to move from a culture of patronage and payment. It wasn't that long ago in historical terms that we paid for our commissions, to a culture of ability and service. And you see this debate going on in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think what we need to get our heads around is how we engage in that debate, to get things done and to influence. And it's something you see people on the ground wrestling with in different ways. And my fifth reflection is actually if you sit back and look at the long-term trends in sub-Saharan Africa, what you see is a rapidly expanding population. You see comparatively slow growth in employment rates. You see increasing urbanization at a pretty dramatic pace. You see increasing interconnectivity of this urbanized youth that will not be employed. And you see a debate taking place in all countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and indeed in this country, which is a debate between wealth redistribution and wealth creation. And of course, if your population is growing, actually, the way out of this is to try and make the pie bigger. And the debate in Africa, in different countries, is not necessarily heading in that direction. So I would characterize that by actually saying the long-term security trends, whilst not critical in sub-Saharan Africa, are at the moment a bit like a slow puncher. And I'll come back to that at the end. So the 5 themes I've sort of picked up are really, first, this persistent engagement is, of course, as it says in the title, a long-term game. Sub-Saharan Africa struggles to get our attention. You know, if we're realistic, it's going to be at least number 5 on a good day, and there are many other things that are going to go and get in the way. But actually, to avoid surprises, we need to understand, we need to develop networks, and we need to use the limited resource that we've got in high payoff interventions and then follow up on them. And I would argue that whilst we have had some extremely effective interventions, and I think the case study of our work with the US to help Malawi generate a battalion for the Force Intervention Brigade in the Congo is a real classic example of where we're doing stuff brilliantly. We then fail to capitalize on that at the next level. And I would argue that there's a real weakness in senior officer engagement to bind those relationships and that influence. Which also brings me nicely on to my second point, which I think is the largest point and would be my takeaway. Ultimately, this activity is relational. And the Army's system and culture is appointment-based and time-based, and these work against each other. And that if you're going to get defense engagement right, you need to look at the bit of the Army that does defense engagement through the lens of trying to achieve relational effect. Because ultimately, you need to pick the phone up to somebody of influence and have a sensible conversation. And I think that would force us to change the way we select DAs, the amount of appointment time they have, the way we resource some of the units that take part in this. And I think there are imaginative opportunities for reservists who live overseas and for the use of civilians as part of the teams who perhaps understand the culture more. And if you look at the assistance that we provide, my third theme is that it basically falls into 2 spectrums. The first is the type of training that we provide. Mission-specific is the sort of tactical end, through professional military education up to management of defense. And I would argue that actually we do mission-specific training brilliantly. We then walk away and come back some years later and wonder why this problem was not fixed. When actually what is really needed is help with professional training and education and the management of defense. And as we get higher up that spectrum, we actually get worse in our delivery. And if we're looking for how we might change, I think we need to move up the spectrum. And secondly, the nature of our relationship. If you actually look at what our British military training and advisory teams have done in Africa, with the exception of BPST East Africa, they have generally been in the response to a security event that has required an armed force to restructure. Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, our help with the South African Defence Force post the ending of apartheid. That mission generally lasts 10 years, at the end of which we've done our job. The team then seems to drift into training and assistance because we're not quite sure what it's there for. It gets salami sliced. And we never move to that next level of relationship, which is a professional army-to-army relationship. So I think we need to be looking from restructuring to professional army-to-army relationship as a spectrum. My fifth theme, which has been covered already, is an obvious point. This is all part of a country-to-country relationship. And I've seen a few examples where we have not quite got that right. So in conclusion, and I had this on my script before we had any of the previous speakers, I would strongly argue that it is in our absolute interest to help the nations of sub-Saharan Africa solve their own problems. Because if you look at those security trends, this is a problem that is probably 20 years down the train track. And actually, if you're looking at the doctrine of persistent engagement, this is absolutely the right place to be helping early. My second point was that I think the advent of regionally aligned forces is extremely helpful and can be applied. There are some out there who see that as a threat. Actually, they need to be convinced that this is a resource that can be applied usefully. And my third concluding point is that deep under all of this, in our overall system, there is a cultural aversion to rank and headquarters. And actually, in the influence game, in the persistent engagement game, senior officer rank matters, and the application of brain power, headquarters to difficult problems, matters. Thank you very much.